Hello friends, and welcome again to a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 1 in our study of Genesis chapter 32. And if you recall from our last lesson, we were looking at the account of Jacob and his family, how they left off from Mesopotamia. They escaped basically from his uncle Laban, escaped unbeknownst to him. They kind of left undercover, you might say, kind of went behind his back, and they were traveling to go back home to Canaan to see his family. And they were doing it under the Lord's supervision, because if you remember, the Lord had told Jacob that now is the time to go. And so that's what they were doing. And we saw where Laban had pursued him for 7 days in an effort to catch up to him and tried to kind of defend his account and kind of grill him, you might say. But we also saw where the Lord had also benefited Jacob and looked out for his welfare by speaking to Laban the night before they would meet together, and kind of instructed him that don't be saying anything good or bad to him, but just basically leave him alone, because this is of the Lord that he's leaving. So they had that encounter, and Laban tried to plead his case and tried to point out how he was being treated unfairly, and that Jacob didn't allow him to give him the proper send-off. And then we saw the incident about how Rachel had stolen his gods, and we talked about that to some extent. He was pretty upset and wrathful about that. And then we also saw where Jacob defended himself by just laying out the case, finally laying out everything before Laban, the fact that he'd been treated unfairly for 20 years, and how Laban had tricked him into marrying the wrong daughter the first time, and all these things finally came out in the open, you might say, and came to light. And so they got all that, they kind of cleared the air with all of these things. And that's where we're going to pick it up in those last verses of chapter 31, and that's verses 43 through 55. And here the Bible says, "And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto their children which they have borne? Now therefore come thou, let us make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee." And Jacob took a stone, and set it up for a pillar. And Jacob said unto his brethren, Gather stones. And they took stones, and made a heap, and they did eat there upon the heap. And Laban called it Jagar Sahadutha, but Jacob called it Gilead. And Laban said, This heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Gilead. And Mizpah, for he said, The Lord watch between me and thee, when we are absent one from another. If thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives besides my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. And Laban said to Jacob, Behold this heap, and behold this pillar, which I have cast betwixt me and thee. This heap be witness, and this pillar be witness, that I will not pass over this heap to thee, and thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge betwixt us. And Jacob sware by the fear of his father Isaac. Then Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount, and called his brethren to eat bread. And they did eat bread, and tarried all night in the mount. And early in the morning Laban rose up, and kissed his sons and his daughters, and blessed them. And Laban departed, and returned to his place. And it's kind of interesting it says he returned to his place, because you remember what he was doing when Jacob and the family decided to leave. Well, there were already 3 days journey between them because of the separation where they were living at. But also Laban was out in the field. He was out shearing sheep. And so he was busy about doing his daily business and just his business in general, and then had to leave all that behind. And so now we see that he's going to return to his place and possibly back to his employment there and try to catch up for lost time on his sheep shearing. But what we see here is that after Jacob pleads his case And basically he double downs on his rebuke of Laban, that it is now Laban that will give an answer. He has effectively been chastised and rebuked by God, and now in addition by Jacob himself. Because you remember, God told him that he knew what he did. He knew how he'd been treating Jacob. And he knew that he'd been really just not really despising him necessarily, but just treating him unfairly, even though that was his son-in-law. It just didn't matter to him. He was all about his own welfare, his own business, his own riches, and it was all about what Laban could get out of the matter. That's what he always looked at. Even when he basically sold his daughters to Jacob, it was all about, well, what am I going to get in return? Well, I'm going to get 7 years of labor in return, and also get the blessings of his God upon me for letting him stay here and letting him work here. So it was all about Laban. And a lot of folks do that nowadays. It's all about what is in it for me. I even think about our country. You remember that one famous statement that was made, I believe it was by President Kennedy, when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country. And there was an actual mentality at that time, in those days, and some days after. And we've seen it especially in days before that. But it used to be, that's the way people would think, was they were very patriotic, and they were all about doing what was good for the people, what was good for the citizens of their towns or their cities. And it was kind of like, hey, let's look out for America. Let's look out for Americans. But somehow that mentality in our society has shifted, and now we find that people's all about, well, just what's in it for me. It's a selfish attitude. It's a self-centered attitude. And it's just an attitude that just excludes the concern for others, but all they're caring about is themselves. And the Bible has a lot to say about that, but it also talks about loving the love for the brethren, but also looking out for those that have needs. And basically that's just the Christian way. But here we see that Laban has just been kind of grilled. He's been grilled. He's been run through the mill, you might say. He's been rebuked by God. He's been rebuked by Jacob. He's basically been rebuked by his own daughters. And it seems like everybody's just, put their thumb on him and just highlighted all of the underhanded and evil things that he's done. And it's brought it out into the open. And so what did we see here? Well, now he's kind of nervous about all this. Now he's kind of fearful because he's concerned about Jacob going back to his family. And who knows, he might raise up, he might tell his whole family about what's been going on. And his family might rise up against him. They might almost create a small army and come back and just, basically wipe him out and ransack him. Maybe steal all his possessions. Who knows? But he's thinking about these things now. He's concerned about it because he knows that he can't contain Jacob. He can't keep him from leaving. But he'd kind of like to, have him leave under better circumstances and with maybe some kind of a formal agreement to ensure his safety. And so that's what he wants to do. And what do we see? Well, we see that first of all, Laban really has no effective response. In reality, he has nothing to say because he knows it's all the truth. He can't come back and he can't combat that when he's got witnesses there that have all been privy to what's been going on. And usually, that is usually the case. If nobody has a response and nobody has a rebuttal, then it's usually because the accusations are true. He could neither justify himself and his actions, nor could he condemn Jacob effectively. But he was simply convicted of his own conscience of his wrong that he had been doing. And we don't really see that he's going to humble himself here and admit his errors. We don't see that he's willing to actually own up to it. He's not willing to ask for Jacob's forgiveness for anything. And he's not really admitting to anything, even though he knows it's true. He's just kind of brushing it under the rug and wants to keep it silent. He doesn't want to talk about it anymore. And he's not even willing to ask for Jacob's forgiveness. His pride and his lack of humility will not allow it. But rather, instead, he changes the subject. And he tries to personalize the matter and basically just sweep the unpopular matters under the rug. What does he say? He says, these daughters are my daughters. These children are my children. These cattle are my cattle. Once again, he wants to lay the guilt trip on Jacob. He knows he can't say anything negative or say anything that's going to cause, like he's going to intrude upon him, or that he's going to cause him harm, or that he's going to get revenge, or he can't speak any of that because God's already forewarned him. And so he's fearing the Lord at this point. But he's still wanting to point out the fact that he feels like what his sons had felt, is that he's stealing these possessions from him, and that he's stealing basically their inheritance. And so once again, he lays out these things. He said, well, look, Jacob, look at all these possessions you have. Everything you're taking with you, these actually, in reality, they belong to me. Just reminding you of that. And so once again, he strives to lay that guilt trip on Jacob. And that's just what most hypocrites, most narcissists, and people that are just ate up with pride, that's exactly what they'll do. Basically, he says, all you see here, Jacob, are mine. The people, the possessions, the animals, everything. It actually belongs to me. Therefore, ultimately, just remember, you've ultimately wronged me. You've stolen my livelihood. And so with that in mind, Jacob, let's come to an agreement between you and me. Let us draw up a covenant that we can both abide by, so that we can maintain peace and harmony between ourselves. And so the indicator is that he's telling Jacob, hey, this is for your benefit. This agreement's going to be for your benefit, that I'm not going to do you any harm. Because you deserve me to do you harm. As I pointed out, you stole all my possessions. You've stolen my family. And in reality, they're mine, but I'm going to let you take them. But this agreement will protect you from worrying about me coming over and, trying to take over or take things back. But in reality, he wants to protect himself and his own livelihood. And so his suggestion is that they draw up an agreement together, a covenant. And it's going to be an agreement that they can both abide by. But the core of his newfound concern was that the words that the Lord had spoken to him, that he was restrained to do what he really wanted to do, and what he really would have laid on Jacob, by the fear of the Lord. And if God puts a warning out, which he's done throughout his word. And, what did he tell Laban? He said, take heed. Take notice, Laban. Listen clearly. Listen very carefully to what I'm telling you, because this is the word of the Lord. And it's something that's, any time the Lord speaks a word, it is vitally important to our welfare. It's vitally important to our well-being. God is concerned about his creation. He wants what's best for mankind. And because of that, he's put warnings, not only guidance and direction and history in his word, but he's put warnings in there too. And basically he's saying, take heed, people. Listen to what I'm saying. These are the things that are pleasing to me. These are the things that are not. This is what you need to do for your salvation. But if you don't, then this is going to be what the result is. If you don't accept my free gift of salvation through my Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, then this is going to be the outcome. So he's given us plainly the clear guidance and the clear warnings there to keep us on the right path, if we'll take heed. And that's the thing. We still have to make that choice, just as Laban had to make this choice here. When he heard the word of the Lord, he had to make a choice whether he was going to obey it or whether he was going to just ignore it and go against it. That was the choice he had. But he had the warning. And so God has given mankind his clear warning in his word. And it's just unfortunate that some that have read about the warnings, have heard the warnings, still don't want to adhere to that. But it's also just sad that we live in such a neglectful society that many have no clue what is in our life's instruction book, which is the Bible, the Word of God. And so that's what we see. And so it was that Laban is seeking to settle the matter in a peaceful way and to formulate a peaceful agreement. And apparently Jacob would let him have his way and his say and his design. And he was willing to go along with it. He figured that's the least he could do. He was leaving. He was leaving. They were leaving. He really wasn't concerned about it. He had no intention on doing Laban harm. He had no intention on going back. He'd already settled the matter. God had already prospered him and allowed him to leave with much goods and possessions. And so in Jacob's mind, the matter was already settled. He was just trying to get rid of Laban once and for all. And so, as we see in this agreement, it's Jacob that takes the first stone and sets it up for a pillar. And, this is something that was often done, as we'll see throughout the Scripture. As often they would take they would make a monument, or they would make, such as this, a pillar or an altar, or whatever the case is. They would put something there as a memorial, and that would be, it's kind of like putting a seal on a document, or it's kind of like signifying, something that's going to be placed there to remind them of the agreement that was made, and that all could see, all could be aware of it. They could go back and look at it, but it's there as a permanent reminder. And it's kind of like any monuments we have today in our society. They're there for permanent reminders. Some of them are there to commemorate maybe an agreement that was made, maybe if there was a truce drawn up between two countries, and they might memorialize that in a document, but they also might memorialize it in a statue. I think about the Statue of Liberty. That was given to us by France. And it was just a tribute to America. It was kind of a thank you tribute from France, but it's also an everlasting memorial to remind us of what had taken place. And a lot of people have forgotten about that. A lot of people haven't even studied the history of it, but that's what it's there for. And so they were going to have this memorial set up, this heap. And so Jacob instructs his men to go and gather more stones. They made a heap. We see where they sat on top of it. Had kind of a fellowship feast, you might say, and to kind of settle the matter. And this monument would signify the covenant between both of them. And Laban named it with a name there, and that name is basically what it means is a gathering. It was a gathering of the testimony of this matter at this place. But Jacob dubbed it Gilead, which, and don't get me if I'm not pronouncing that quite right. I always get these words a little off center when it comes to pronunciation, but basically it's Gilead, and in essence it means the same thing, a heap of testimony. And so that's what they did, and then the mound would signify this agreement, this mound of stones. It would signify the covenant and the testimony that they were just about to implement. And so it was that the name Gilead would stick, and in addition it would be referred to as Mizpah, which is a place of pausing and reflection. So all fitting names for this memorial that they're about to institute. And it would also be that it was a place to consider while they're yet apart by a great distance, and the fact that they would have to pause and consider the agreement that was made, and that even if they were out of sight of one another and they couldn't monitor one another, that the Lord will observe their doings and how they conduct themselves. And that the Lord was present in this place, and He was seeing the agreement. He knew the agreement they made, and that He would oversee that agreement and the covenant that was made between the both of them. And so He'll see how I conduct myself, Jacob, and also how you will conduct yourself with my property, with my possessions, and with my people. And what was the terms of the agreement? Well, first, if thou shalt afflict my daughters, or if thou shalt take other wives besides my daughters, no man is with us. See, God is witness betwixt me and thee. Well, he didn't really have any cause to say that. I mean, Jacob, he'd been married for 20 years. And he had never given cause for concern. He'd never given cause for a reason to suspect him of becoming any other husband than he had been for the past 20 years. But it could be also that Laban knows that now, he's been there to monitor them. They've been close by. They've been in close proximity. And when you think about that, any family could do that. I mean, any family nowadays, if their daughters were getting married and they're going to be moving out of state, if they're close by, you can kind of observe and monitor how their family is getting along and how they're treating each other and how things are going. But when they get out of distance like that, moving out of the country, well, it may not be a bad thing to put a little reminder out there and maybe a little threat on them. But, for whatever reason, even though their own father had basically been the one afflicting them, he would not allow their own husband to do the same. And that God himself would be the witness to the terms of the covenant. And he says, I will not pass over this heap to thee, and thou shalt not pass over this heap and this pillar unto me for harm. Yeah, you can come visit Jacob. You can come and bring my daughters to see me and the grandchildren and so forth. But we will never pass over this embarkation here, this line of division in order to harm one another. It's going to be a peace treaty. And that Jacob should be a good neighbor and not change character and rise up against Laban to do him harm or otherwise. No act of hostility should ever pass between them, and that Jacob should basically forgive and forget all the wrongs that he had received and not remember them against Laban and his family. He wants him to let bygones be bygones and not hold a grudge, not hold anything against him in times to come, and that it would be the God of Abraham that is the witness to these things, because he knew how godly a man Jacob was. He knew the relationship that Jacob had with God, and he knew that Jacob feared the Lord. And so he wanted to remind him that your God is the witness, that you say you're going to abide by this. And just keep in mind, this is not just between me and thee, this is between us and your God as well. And thus it would be that the God of Abraham would be the witness to these things. They were taking the oath before God Almighty, and as such it was to be honored, heeded, and ratified with the penalty of the wrath of God should anyone become a truce breaker. A pillar was erected and a heap of stones was raised. It would be a perpetual reminder and a symbol of these oaths that were now taking place. It would be a holy place. And to confirm the act of sacrifice would now take place. An offering unto the Lord, and as an act of reconciliation, they would break bread and have fellowship and food upon the altar of sacrifice. And if any disrupted the agreement, notice who would be their judge: the God of Abraham, from whom Jacob descended, the God of Nahor, from whom Laban descended. And the Lord would watch, and the Lord will judge, and the Lord will have his all-seeing eyes upon us. He will know if we are conducting our affairs right or wrong. And when we are far from each other and out of each other's sight, we will still be under the Lord's watchful eye. He will be the overseer of our doings, and he will be our judge. And I think, as Christians, we got to remember that we can be, sometimes we can still think that we're out of the sight of somebody, if we're doing something maybe not quite right, or if we, I think about some of the guys who were in the military, and they would travel overseas, and it was just like they lost their mind, and I don't know how many of them were Christians or otherwise, but it was just like a lot of these guys just lost their minds, that it was like they were on another planet, that their conduct and the things that they did and some of the things they participated in, there's no way they would have ever done that, in the States or living with their families, but they just felt like they were out of the sight, and there was enough distance that they could get away with it. Nothing would ever be talked about or said about it. But, I think the Christians would be reminded that, hey, God, he's watching you in that place just as much as he's watching you over here, and he knows. And he'll expose those things and bring those things to light when you least expect it. So we've always got to keep in mind that our God is ever present, he's ever watchful, He knows all. He's about all. He's always seeing the affairs of men, and we have to answer to him directly. So that's what we got to keep in mind. So this was a pillar and a altar and a heap that was dedicated unto the Lord, and they made sacrifice and had a meal. And then we see that very next morning that Laban arose early and prepared for his departure. He kissed his sons and he kissed his daughters, and he blessed them, and he left under peaceable terms. So they finally had that break was officially made. And so with that, we're going to pick it up in chapter 32, and we're just going to read a couple verses here to get started. And here we read in verses 1 and 2, "And Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met with him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, 'This is God's host.' And he called the name of that place Mahanaim." Now Jacob was now able to finally leave Laban behind. And so he departs. They continue on their journey going towards Canaan. And what does it say? It says, "And Jacob went on his way." So he had his route picked out. He had he had his map out. He had his markers. He had his places of reference. And he knew how to get there. And they still had quite a journey to go on. And so their entourage left, and they were going about their way. And then what's the next thing we see? It says the angels of God met him. Wow. Wouldn't that be something? I always think about that, when the angels of God. And you know, in the New Testament, it tells us that another reason we need to treat people properly, even if they're strangers or even if there's somebody we've never seen before, is because it says sometimes that we may have entertained angels unawares. And I know we see these old movies where they always have angels in the bodies of people and doing different things and conducting, and a lot of them are kind of corny and a lot of them aren't really scriptural. But it is very, just as demons can inhabit the bodies of people, well, angels can take on that form as well. No, they're not humans, but they can take on human form. And so there are occasions where we may have encountered an angel and not been aware of it. Maybe they were there to guide us. Maybe they were there definitely for a purpose, for sure. But it could even be just to see what our reaction is going to be to a certain situation. But here we see that Jacob has encountered these angels. It says they met with him. So somewhere along the way, Jacob had a visible encounter with these angels, whether it be in a vision by day or a dream by night. He was welcomed by a divine welcoming committee back to his country. These were the ambassadors for the Lord. And he knew immediately who they were. Because what does he say? He says, "This is God's host." So in his condition, there was no mistaking who they were. He knew instantly who they were. And he called that name, the name of that place, Mahanaim. And so he is now reminded that he is encompassed and accompanied by God's favor. Safety and protection will be afforded by the Lord. And perhaps they appeared one on either side like sentinels at a gate. Perhaps they were on both sides of the road to greet him. Or perhaps they were on one in the front and one in the rear in order to show him that they were providing protection for his entourage. One in the front and one from the rear. And so it was that he named that place Mahanaim, meaning two armies. The fact that he was allies with the angels, with the head and the host and the captains of God's armies. And that he had two armies that was on his side. And that was just God's confirmation that he was not only with them, but he was going to continue to be with him and guide him and provide him safety on his journey back home. Well, we're going to have to leave off there. We'll pick it up in our next lesson, verses 3 through 8 of chapter 32. And there we're going to see what Jacob's next concern is. And, we haven't heard a lot about Esau. It's been a long time. It's been 20 years. But now Jacob's got to deal with that issue because when he left, they were at odds with each other, and he had a death threat upon him, and so he's got to make sure that the coast is clear for him to come back, and that he doesn't have to deal with that. So he's got a lot of things on his mind. He's already had things going on with Laban, and the things going on with the cattle, and the things going on with his wives, and I mean, he must have been just a pretty firm, resolute guy to be able to withstand all these things that he's been encountering. But we're going to see what he's going to have to take care of business in the next few verses there, and we'll pick it up there in our next lesson. Hope to see you then. Thanks.